Mary was born on the 30th of April 1662 at St. James's Palace in London, the first child of James, Duke of York, and his wife, and Hyde to survive beyond infancy. Her father was the younger brother of the reigning King of England, Scotland, and Ireland, Charles II, who had only recently restored the Stuart monarchy after one of the most turbulent periods in British history. Her mother was the daughter of Edward Hyde, the first Earl of Clarendon, who in the early 1660s was the most powerful minister in Charles II government. On paper, Mary arrived into a position of extraordinary privilege. In practice, she arrived into a family carrying more unresolved tension than most dynasties could survive, and the tension would shape every decade of her short life. To understand what kind of world Mary was born into, it is necessary to go back a generation, to the catastrophe that had defined the Stuart family before she drew her first breath. Her grandfather, King Charles I, had been one of the most consequential rulers in the history of the British Isles. Consequential not for what he built, but for what he broke. In the late 1630s, his efforts to impose a particular form of conservative Protestantism on Scotland had been received not as a religious reform, but as an assault on the Scottish Church, which was governed along Presbyterian lines rooted in a Calvinist tradition that had no patience for the kind of liturgical ceremony Charles was attempting to enforce. The Scots rose against him. Charles, facing rebellion in the north, turned to the English Parliament for support and money, and found that Parliament had its own grievances, its own demands, and its own sense of how power in England ought to be distributed. What followed was not a simple confrontation between a king and his critics, but a full-scale collapse of political order. War spread across all three kingdoms. Ireland rose in rebellion. The fighting that consumed the 1640s left tens of thousands dead, and the English political community so deeply divided that it eventually did something that had almost no precedent in European history. It put the king on trial, convicted him of treason against his own people, and executed him in January 1649. For James and his brother Charles, who were teenagers when their father died on the scaffold, the execution was not merely a personal tragedy. It was a political education of the most brutal kind. It told them that the loyalty of subjects could not be assumed, that religion was a weapon as dangerous as any army, and that the wrong decision on a matter of faith could cost a king not just his crown but his life. James and Charles spent the 1650s in exile on the continent, moving between the courts of France, the Spanish Netherlands, and other Catholic European powers who offered them hospitality, if not always material assistance. It was during these years that both brothers developed a familiarity with Roman Catholicism that would, in James's case, eventually become something far deeper than mere familiarity. James converted to Catholicism, privately at first, and then in a way that could no longer be concealed. Charles's own religious sympathies remained ambiguous throughout most of his life, though on his deathbed, he too received the Catholic sacraments. But it was James whose conversion would become the central political crisis of the age. The republic that had replaced the monarchy after Charles I's execution lasted only 11 years. Oliver Cromwell, the parliamentary general who had become the republic's dominant figure, died in 1658, and the political experiment began to unravel almost immediately without him. By 1660, the English political community had concluded, with some collective embarrassment, that it preferred the House of Stuart after all. An invitation was sent to Charles II, then living in exile in the Spanish Netherlands, and he returned to England in the spring of 1660 to be restored as king amid scenes of popular celebration. He rode into London to cheering crowds, reclaimed his throne, and set about overseeing a restoration not just of the monarchy, but of the cultural and social atmosphere that had been suppressed under the austere Puritan rule of the preceding decade. The Restoration era that Mary grew up in was known, with some justification, as a period of liberation after years of Puritan severity. The theaters reopened. Music returned to the churches. The court became a center of fashion, wit, and entertainment that had been impossible under Cromwell's rule. Charles himself was a man of considerable personal charm who made no secret of his preference for pleasure over piety. He had numerous mistresses, fathered a staggering number of illegitimate children whose exact count historians are still debating, and presided over a court that was by any measure the most colorful and least repressed in Europe. It was into this world of renewed gaiety and royal excess that Mary was born in 1662, the daughter of the king's brother and, in the absence of any legitimate royal children, second in line to the throne of three kingdoms. But the religious tensions that had brought her grandfather to the scaffold had not been resolved by the Restoration. They had merely been quieted, and they would not stay quiet for long. The problem, at its heart, was simple enough to state, though enormously complicated to manage. England had been a Protestant country since the reign of Henry VIII more than a century earlier. If you are enjoying this video, consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel so you never miss a new biography. And now I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below telling me where in the world you are watching this from. The Protestant faith was not merely the official religion of the state. It was, for a significant and vocal portion of the English population, central to their understanding of who they were and what they stood against. What they stood against, above all, was Rome. The fear of Roman Catholicism, its hierarchy, its allegiance to a foreign power in the form of the Pope, its association in English minds with the Spanish Armada, and with the martyrdom of Protestant heroes under the Catholic Queen Mary Tudor, was not a mild theological preference. It was a deep cultural conviction that shaped how the English people perceived their own history and their own identity. To place a Catholic on the throne of England was, in this understanding, not merely a religious matter but a threat to the entire fabric of the nation. James's conversion to Catholicism, therefore, was not a private matter that could be set aside without consequence. By 1673, when the English Parliament passed the Test Act requiring all public figures and government officials to declare their religion formally, his faith became a matter of public record and public alarm. The man who stood to inherit the throne was a Roman Catholic. Charles II had no legitimate children. The line of succession ran directly through James and through James's daughters after him. England was facing the very real possibility of a Catholic monarchy, and the fear of what that might mean drove the political debates of the next decade with an urgency that could not be reasoned away. Into all of this Mary was born and grew up, largely insulated from the worst of it, but never entirely free of its consequences. Her uncle the king was absolutely determined that whatever James did with his own religious convictions, the next generation of royal children would be raised as Anglicans. He was too politically astute to allow the future of the Protestant succession to rest on the personal choices of a man he knew was already drifting toward Rome. Mary and her sister were raised in the Anglican faith, baptized into it, educated within it, and kept within its orbit through childhood and adolescence. Charles's insistence on this point was one of the most consequential decisions of his reign, though it attracted little attention at the time. It ensured that when the crisis he feared eventually came, there would be Protestant heirs available, daughters of the Catholic king, who were themselves committed Protestants, and who could therefore provide the constitutional cover for whatever measures the Protestant political establishment might feel compelled to take. Mary's childhood was spent not in the immediate company of her parents, but in her own household at Richmond Palace, a short distance from London on the southern bank of the Thames. This was entirely typical of royal child-rearing in the 17th century. Children of the royal family were provided with their own staff, their own routines, and their own domestic world, which meant that the figures who shaped a royal child's early development were often not the parents themselves, but the governors, tutors, and attendants assigned to the household. For Mary, the dominant figure in that world was Lady Frances Villiers, the wife of Edward Villiers, a member of a family that had been deeply embedded in royal service for generations. Lady Villiers was a capable and well-connected woman, and the household she ran at Richmond gave Mary a structured and intellectually enriching environment in which to grow. Her education reflected the Renaissance humanist ideals that had been fashionable among the European elite since the 16th century. She learned to read and engage with the Greek and Roman classics that formed the foundation of educated discourse. She learned French, which had become the language of diplomatic culture and social prestige across Europe, and which she would eventually find essential in her years living in the Low Countries. She was taught to dance, which was considered an essential accomplishment for any woman of noble rank in early modern Europe, and to play music. It was, in short, the education of a princess, thorough, graceful, and designed to prepare her for a life of court existence, and eventual marriage to some European noble whose identity would be determined by the diplomatic calculations of her uncle the king. What the education could not prepare her for was the grief that ran through her childhood like a thread. Her family's suffering in the years between her birth and her early adolescence was extraordinary even by the standards of an era in which infant mortality was commonplace and the death of children was a sorrow that every family of every class could expect to face. Before Mary was born, her parents had already lost a son, an infant named Charles who died of smallpox at 7 months old. After her came a succession of siblings whose lives were brief, and whose deaths came in clusters that must have made the Stuart nurseries feel perpetually shadowed. A brother named James, born just over a year after Mary, died before his 4th birthday during the last major outbreak of bubonic plague to strike England in the early modern period. Only weeks before his death, an infant brother named Charles died of convulsions at St. James's Palace at 10 months old. 2 deaths in the same family within the same month. 2 years later, another infant, Henrietta, died at 10 months. And then, in the spring of 1671, the tragedy reached its most devastating point. And Hyde, Mary's mother, died from what is understood to have been advanced breast cancer. She was 33 years old. 10 weeks later, her only surviving son, Edgar, died at 3 years of age. Before the year was out, the youngest child, Catherine, died at approximately 10 months old, the last of a series of infant deaths that left an entire generation of the Duke of York's legitimate children reduced to 2 survivors. Mary was 9 years old. Her sister, Anne, was 6. Out of 8 children that James and Anne had brought into the world together, only those 2 remained. It is difficult to know precisely how much of this tragedy the young Mary processed or understood in the way an adult would. She had been raised in a separate household, at some emotional distance from her parents. The deaths of infant siblings whom she may never have known well were perhaps less immediately devastating than the loss of a brother or sister with whom she had shared daily life. But the cumulative weight of so much death, including the loss of her mother before she turned 10, must have left a mark that shaped her understanding of the world as a place where the people closest to you could be taken without warning and without recourse. It may explain something of the intensity with which she formed the attachments she did form, and one attachment in particular, which has fascinated and puzzled historians ever since. In the early 1670s, following the death of Anne Hyde, the household of Mary and her sister Anne received a new maid of honor, a young woman named Frances Apsley, the daughter of Sir Alan Apsley, a soldier and military administrator who had served the royalist cause through the civil wars of the 1640s and been rewarded generously for it in the years after the Restoration. Frances was nearly 10 years older than Mary and occupied the kind of position that in the intimate world of a royal household could easily become one of the most significant relationships in a young woman's life. For Mary, it clearly became exactly that. Beginning around 1675 and continuing for years afterward, she wrote to Frances in terms that went well beyond the affectionate language of friendship that was conventional between women of the 17th century. She cast herself as a devoted wife and addressed Francis as her husband, writing with an ardor that was sustained, specific, and deeply personal. Her sister Anne wrote in similar terms to Francis during the same period. Even after Mary's marriage took her out of England and across the sea to the Low Countries, the letters continued, with Mary declaring to Francis that she loved her above all things in the world. Historians have debated the nature of these letters ever since they came to serious scholarly attention. Some have argued that they point toward a genuine bisexuality or lesbian inclination in Mary, expressing feelings that could never be acted upon given who she was and when she lived. Others have suggested that the letters should be read within the context of the theatrical culture of Restoration London, where the plays being performed on the London stage frequently featured cross-dressing, romantic disguise, and women adopting male romantic roles, and that Mary and Anne may have been engaging in a kind of literary play that drew on those conventions rather than expressing literal desires. The honest answer is that certainty is not available to us across the distance of 3 centuries. What can be said with confidence is that the letters represent something real, a depth of feeling, whether primarily emotional or something more complicated, that Frances Apsley inspired in the young princess, and that Mary herself evidently had no desire to conceal from the object of it. Whatever the nature of that attachment, it was always temporary in the deepest sense. Mary was a princess of England, the niece of a childless king, the daughter of the heir to the throne. The question of who she would marry was never in doubt as a category. It was only a matter of which European noble would be selected and which political purpose the alliance would serve. By the mid-1670s, with Charles II still producing no legitimate heir and his brother James's Catholicism becoming an increasingly destabilizing factor in English politics, the choice of a husband for Mary had acquired a strategic weight that went well beyond the personal. She had become, in the cold language of diplomatic calculation, a significant piece on the board of European power. The debate was essentially between two options. One was the Grand Dauphin Louis, the eldest son and heir of King Louis XIV of France, the most powerful monarch in Europe and the ruler of a vast Catholic kingdom that had spent much of the previous 2 decades attempting to conquer the Dutch Republic. He was close to Mary in age, and a marriage to him would have bound England to France in an alliance that would have dramatically altered the balance of power in Western Europe. The other option was William, Prince of Orange, the stadtholder of Holland and Zeeland and the dominant political and military figure in the Dutch Republic, the very state that France was attempting to destroy. William was already in his mid-20s, considerably older than Mary, but he was a committed Protestant, a proven military commander, and the leader of the European coalition that was most determinately resisting French expansion. The English government decided that the Dutch alliance was preferable, and sometime in 1677 Mary was informed that she would marry William. She was 15 years old. It is not recorded what she felt when she received this news, but the ceremony itself provided some evidence. The wedding took place on the 4th of November 1677 at St. James's Palace, conducted by Henry Compton, the Bishop of London, who would become one of the most significant recurring figures in Mary's life. William happened to celebrate his 27th birthday on the same day as the wedding. Mary, 12 years younger than her new husband, cried throughout the ceremony in a manner that was remarked upon by those present. Whether the tears were a response to leaving England, to the prospect of marriage to a man she barely knew, to grief at the end of whatever private attachments she had formed, or simply to the overwhelming weight of the occasion, or all of these things together, no one recorded with precision. What was recorded was that the king, her uncle Charles, oversaw the bedding ceremony that evening with the cheerful informality he brought to most occasions, escorting the couple to their chamber in the presence of family members and attendants as royal custom required. Whispers about William's own inclinations were already circulating well before the wedding. He had kept a number of close male companions around him throughout his adult life in a manner that had led a good many observers to assume the relationships were more than platonic. Whether the whispers were accurate or simply the product of court gossip can no longer be established, but they were persistent enough that they were a known feature of the landscape into which Mary was walking. Two people whose sexual orientations were the subject of speculation and private comment, bound to each other by diplomacy and dynastic calculation, beginning a marriage whose success no one was ready to predict. This was the foundation on which one of the more consequential royal partnerships in the history of Britain would be built. After 2 weeks, during which stormy weather kept them in England, William and Mary departed for the Dutch Republic in early December 1677. They arrived at The Hague on the 14th of that month, greeted with the kind of formal ceremonial welcome that a republic reserved for the closest thing to royalty it was willing to acknowledge. Mary had left England at 15 years old, a girl raised in royal households, educated in the classics, and formed by a childhood of grief and loss that had given her a seriousness beyond her years. She did not know, as the ships crossed the gray water of the North Sea, that she would not see her home country again for more than a decade. She did not know what waited for her in the Low Countries, or what the decisions being made by the men around her would eventually require of her. She only knew that she was leaving. The rest was still ahead of her. The Dutch Republic that Mary arrived in during December 1677 was, by any reasonable measure, one of the most remarkable political and commercial entities in the world. It was small in terms of territory. The Netherlands today gives a reasonable sense of its geographic footprint, but its reach extended far beyond its borders in ways that made it a genuinely global power. Over the course of the 17th century, Dutch merchants and their government had built a commercial empire that stretched from the coast of North America to the Caribbean, from the southern tip of Africa to Ceylon and the East Indies. Amsterdam had emerged alongside London as one of the birthplaces of modern capitalism, with functioning stock markets, joint stock corporations, and a financial infrastructure that no other country in Europe could yet match. The Dutch had become, in the space of a few generations, enormously wealthy, and that wealth had funded one of the great cultural flowerings of the early modern period. The painters of the Dutch Golden Age, Rembrandt, Vermeer, Hals, had produced work that placed the Republic at the forefront of European artistic life. It was a country that took justifiable pride in what it had built. It was also a country under sustained pressure. The very wealth and strategic position that made the Dutch Republic significant also made it a target, and the most persistent and dangerous threat came from its southern neighbor. King Louis XIV of France had spent much of his reign attempting to expand French territory into the Low Countries and Western Germany, and the Dutch Republic stood directly in the path of those ambitions. The Franco-Dutch War, which had been grinding on since 1672, was still in its final stages when Mary arrived. William had spent much of the previous 5 years organizing the military and diplomatic resistance to French expansion, and it was largely his efforts that had prevented the Republic from being absorbed into the growing French sphere of influence. He was, by 1677, one of the most important figures in European politics, not merely the stadtholder of Holland and Zeeland, but the central organizer of resistance to Louis XIV across the continent. The marriage that had brought Mary to The Hague had not been arranged because of who she was alone. It had been arranged because William needed the English alliance that the marriage represented, and because the English government needed a reliable Protestant partner on the continent. Both sides understood this plainly. The practical consequence for the early years of Mary's marriage was that her husband was frequently absent. William was a soldier and a statesman who spent considerable time away from The Hague managing the military and political demands of a republic still at war. Mary was left to establish herself in a new country, learn its customs and its language, build relationships with the people around her, and manage the responsibilities of her position largely on her own. That she did so successfully, and that the Dutch people took quickly and warmly to their new princess, says something about her personal qualities. She was not a woman who required constant supervision or support. She was capable of building a life in unfamiliar circumstances, and she did. The early signs of a genuine attachment between Mary and William appeared relatively quickly, founded not on the romantic basis that their wedding had conspicuously lacked, but on the more durable ground of shared religious conviction and mutual respect. Both were committed Protestants in an era when that conviction carried political as well as personal significance, and both understood that their union was as much a statement about the Protestant cause in Europe as it was a personal relationship. William was not, by any account, a warm or demonstratively affectionate man. He was reserved, physically unimpressive, asthmatic, and entirely focused on the political and military responsibilities he considered his primary purpose in life. But he respected Mary, relied on her, and trusted her judgment in ways that would become clear in the years ahead. It was not the marriage of two people deeply in love, but it became the marriage of two people who understood each other and who worked effectively together toward shared ends. The one grief of the marriage that never resolved itself was the absence of children. Mary became pregnant in the early months of her marriage, and the Dutch people, who had taken a genuine interest in the new wife of the Prince of Orange, were pleased by the news. But in the summer of 1678, when Mary visited Breda where William was overseeing the southern defenses against continuing French incursions, she fell ill and suffered a miscarriage. It was a painful loss, and it was followed by further illnesses in 1679 and 1680, periods of serious sickness which historians generally interpret as involving at least one further miscarriage, though the precise details are not recorded with certainty. The cumulative effect of these complications appears to have been permanent. Mary and William would never have children, despite Mary's expressed wish throughout the 1680s that they would. It was a private sorrow that she carried throughout her adult life, one made more pointed by the fact that the question of succession, who would follow William and Mary, was never merely personal, but always political. During the years when she was not occupied with the demands of public life or recovering from illness, Mary found genuine satisfaction in the world of gardens and architecture that would become one of the defining interests of her life. The Palace of Het Loo in Apeldoorn, in the province of Gelderland, was the primary country residence of the House of Orange-Nassau, and Mary threw herself into the development of its gardens with real enthusiasm and considerable knowledge. She collaborated with Claude Descots, a French architect and landscape designer who had received his training under André Lenotre, the man responsible for the spectacular formal gardens of Versailles outside Paris. The influence of the French royal tradition on the work at Het Loo was visible in the formal geometric layouts, the water features, and the careful balance between natural and architectural elements that characterized the finished result. It was the beginning of an interest in gardens and palace design that would find its fullest expression later, in England, when Mary had the resources of a monarchy behind her. While Mary was building her life in the Low Countries, the political situation in England was moving through a series of developments that would eventually make her own position there unavoidable. The exclusion crisis of the late 1670s and early 1680s was the most direct expression of the anxiety that James's Catholicism had generated in the English political community. Following the Test Act of 1673, which had forced all public officials to declare their religion and thereby made James's conversion to Catholicism a matter of public record, a significant faction within the English Parliament moved to have James formally excluded from the succession on account of his faith. The debates were heated and the political maneuvering considerable, but ultimately Charles II resisted the pressure. He prorogued and dissolved parliaments that threatened to pass the Exclusion Bill, and by 1681 the crisis had passed without James being removed from the line of succession. His position as heir to the throne was confirmed, though the episode had made clear that a substantial part of the English political establishment regarded the prospect of a Catholic king with profound unease. Charles himself was a man who navigated these tensions with considerable political skill, though his personal life did nothing to simplify the situation around the succession. He had an extraordinary number of illegitimate children. Historians continue to debate the precise count, and there is reasonable doubt that Charles himself kept track with any great accuracy. Among his most notable mistresses were Barbara Palmer, Catherine Pegg, the actress Nell Gwynn, and Mary Davis, and the children he had with various women were raised at court and granted noble titles in due course. But his marriage to Catherine of Braganza, the Portuguese princess he had wed in 1662, produced no living children. Catherine suffered 3 miscarriages in the early years of the marriage, and thereafter the union remained childless. Suggestions were made over the years that Charles should divorce her and take a new wife who might produce an heir, but he consistently refused to do so, maintaining a personal loyalty to Catherine that coexisted with his serial infidelities in the way that such contradictions often do in complicated people. The consequence was that when Charles died in February 1685, possibly from uremia, though the exact cause has been debated, there was no legitimate child to succeed him. James, Duke of York, became King James II of England, Scotland, and Ireland. The accession that a significant portion of the English political community had spent the better part of a decade trying to prevent had come to pass. James was now king, and within months of taking the throne he made clear that the concerns his critics had raised about his intentions were not without foundation. He moved quickly to favor Catholics in appointments to government and military positions, began to dismantle the legal arrangements that had protected Protestant privileges, and signaled in a variety of ways that the religious direction of his reign would be toward Rome rather than away from it. The anxiety that had driven the exclusion crisis surged back into political life with renewed intensity. There was one episode in the early period of James's reign that illustrated, with particular clarity, the ambiguous position that Mary and William occupied in relation to English politics at this time. For several years before James's accession, a man named James Scott, the Duke of Monmouth, had been a prominent figure at The Hague. Monmouth was King Charles II's eldest illegitimate son, born to Lucy Walter, a Welsh noblewoman who had been Charles's mistress while he was in exile in the late 1640s. He was a Protestant, he was popular in England among those who feared a Catholic succession, and he had the kind of personal charisma that made him attractive to those looking for an alternative to James. Mary and William had given him a conspicuous welcome at The Hague, and allowed him a prominent place in their social and political circle, an accommodation that was, at minimum, a signal of sympathy toward the idea that there were alternatives to James worth considering. When Charles died in 1685, Monmouth decided to act on the support he believed he had. In the summer of that year, he landed in the southwest of England with a small force and launched a rebellion intended to seize the throne from James and claim it for himself. It was poorly organized from the outset, failed to attract anything approaching the popular support he had expected, and was suppressed by James's forces within a matter of weeks. Monmouth was captured, tried for treason, and executed on the 15th of July 1685. He was 36 years old. Mary and William moved quickly to distance themselves from his actions once it became clear that the rebellion had failed, and they had been careful not to provide him with any direct material support before it began. But the years of hospitality and prominence they had extended to him at The Hague had been noticed, and the ambiguity of their position in relation to James's kingship was a matter that many politically attentive people in England had filed away. James pressed forward with his religious agenda through 1686 and 1687 with an urgency that suggested either great confidence or poor political judgment, or perhaps both. He issued the Declaration of Indulgence in 1687, which suspended the penal laws against Catholics and nonconformists, an exercise of royal prerogative that Parliament had not sanctioned and that many regarded as a direct challenge to the constitutional arrangements of the kingdom. He continued placing Catholics in positions of military and governmental authority. He attempted to pack Parliament with men who would support his policies. The Protestant political establishment watched all of this with growing alarm, but the situation still lacked the particular trigger that would transform alarm into action. That trigger arrived in the summer of 1688 in the form of a birth. James's second wife, Mary of Modena, had been married to him since 1673 but had suffered a series of unsuccessful pregnancies over the years. In June 1688, she gave birth to a son, James Francis Edward, who was immediately christened and baptized as a Catholic. The birth of a male heir was a development of enormous political consequence. Until that moment, the Protestant political establishment had been able to console itself with the knowledge that James was aging, that his two Protestant daughters from his first marriage stood next in line to the throne, and that the Catholic experiment would therefore be temporary. The birth of James Francis Edward changed that calculation entirely. A Catholic male heir would by convention and law displace Mary in the succession and be raised within his father's faith. The Catholic experiment might not be temporary at all. It might be the beginning of a dynasty. The response of a portion of the political establishment was immediate and remarkable. A conspiracy theory spread through England almost before the child had been formally presented. A claim that the baby was not truly the child of James and Mary of Modena at all, but a substitute infant smuggled into the birth chamber in a warming pan to provide James with a fraudulent heir. The claim was almost certainly false, but it was repeated with conviction by people who found it politically useful, and it provided a justification for what was already being planned. James's position as king had become, for a significant number of the most powerful men in England, simply intolerable. The response they settled on was not another rebellion of the Monmouth variety, an ill-prepared domestic uprising that could be crushed by a loyal army. They had watched that fail. What they needed was something altogether more substantial. A foreign military force, large enough and well-organized enough to succeed where domestic resistance had not. And the man best placed to provide such a force was already married to the woman who had the strongest legitimate claim to the English throne. On the 30th of June 1688, a letter left England carried by a trusted messenger heading for The Hague. It was signed by 7 men, some of the most powerful political and ecclesiastical figures in England, and it was addressed to William of Orange. Its contents were straightforward in their request, even if the implications of what it was asking were enormous. It asked William to intervene in Britain with military force, to depose James, and to claim the throne for himself and Mary. It declared the new male heir illegitimate. It listed the grievances against James's rule, and it placed on the table an offer that would require both William and Mary to make decisions that could not be unmade. The letter arrived at The Hague, and Mary read it. What it was asking her to do was to participate in the overthrow of her own father. The letter that arrived at The Hague on the 30th of June 1688 carried 7 signatures, and those 7 men have been known to history ever since by the name posterity gave them, the Immortal Seven. They were Henry Sidney, Edward Russell, Charles Talbot the Earl of Shrewsbury, William Cavendish the Earl of Devonshire, Thomas Osborne the Earl of Danby, Richard Viscount Lumley, and Henry Compton the Bishop of London, the same man who had married William and Mary at St. James's Palace 11 years earlier. Between them, they represented the breadth of the Protestant political establishment in England, spanning the aristocracy, the military, and the church. They were not radicals or revolutionaries in the ordinary sense. They were men of property and position who had concluded that the king they served had made their continued loyalty impossible. The letter they sent laid out its case with clarity. James's aggressive promotion of Catholicism in government and public life had gone beyond what England's Protestant constitution could absorb. The birth of James Francis Edward, the new male heir, had removed the prospect of a natural Protestant succession through Mary and Anne. The child, the letter asserted, was illegitimate, not truly the son of James and Mary of Medina, but a substitute infant introduced fraudulently to provide the king with a Catholic heir. This claim was almost certainly without foundation, but it served the political purpose of allowing the signatories to argue that they were not asking William to usurp the throne, but to restore the legitimate line. They were inviting him to enforce Mary's rightful claim. They told him that the people of England would support him. They told him the army would not resist. And they asked him to come. William had been watching events in England with a great deal of interest and a strategic intelligence that understood exactly what the moment offered. He was already preparing for a renewal of the conflict with France, the 9 Years' War that would break out later that same year, and having England as an ally rather than a neutralized or hostile neighbor was of enormous strategic value. He read the letter. He accepted the invitation without significant hesitation. The decision that required rather more careful consideration was Mary's. What the letter was asking of her was not a simple political calculation. It was asking her to consent to the military invasion of her own country by her husband's army, the forced removal of her father from his throne, and her own installation as queen in his place. James was a man who had been damaged by exile, by the execution of his father, by years of political insecurity, but he was also a man who had, by Mary's own account in the letter she exchanged with him, expressed genuine love for his eldest daughter throughout her life. He had written to her in those months, with a directness that made her conflict all the more acute. "You will be still as good a daughter to a father that has always loved you so tenderly," he told her. The words were not calculated to make her decision easier. She was clearly torn. The sources that survive from this period, including her own writings, make plain that she did not approach the question with indifference or purely political detachment. She understood what was being asked and she understood what it cost. The conflict she faced was between two things she held genuinely and deeply: her loyalty to her father and her Protestant faith, with its associated sense of duty to the English people and their constitutional inheritance. In the end, she chose the faith and the duty. Several considerations shaped that choice. She had been raised away from her parents, in her own household, and had left England at 15 to live in another country. The bond with her father, real as it was, had been formed across distance and intermittent contact rather than shared daily life. Her bond with William, built over 11 years of marriage in the Dutch Republic, was closer and more present. Her bond with the Protestant cause, formed in childhood by her uncle's insistence and deepened by her own sincere conviction, was the most fundamental orientation of her adult life. When those loyalties were placed in the balance, the outcome, however painful, was not ultimately in doubt. William moved forward with the preparations that his acceptance of the invitation required. The Dutch Republic was already heavily militarized in anticipation of renewed conflict with France, and he was able to assemble an invasion force with a speed that reflected both the Republic's military readiness and the urgency of the moment. He gathered an army of 20,000 men, a force substantial enough to face whatever resistance James's military could organize. He assembled the fleet of transport ships needed to carry that army across the North Sea. He waited for a favorable wind, and when it came in early November 1688, the fleet set sail. The landing came in the English West Country, at Brixham in Devon, on the 5th of November 1688. William came ashore, and began the march toward London. What happened next was less a military campaign than a slow collapse of royal authority. James had an army. He had a navy. On paper, the forces available to him were sufficient to contest the advance. In practice, the army and navy were composed overwhelmingly of Protestants commanded by Protestant officers, and those men looked at the situation in front of them and made their calculations. They were being asked to fight for a Catholic king against a Protestant prince who was married to the Protestant heir to the throne. One by one, senior commanders began to signal that they would not resist. Some defected openly to William's side. Others simply withdrew their cooperation from James's cause. The military resistance that James needed never materialized. James's response to the disintegration of his support was increasingly erratic. He made gestures toward conciliation, offering concessions he had refused to consider for the previous 3 years. He convened meetings of peers and bishops to discuss a settlement. But the credibility required to make those gestures convincing had been spent. The men he needed to persuade no longer believed that agreements with him would hold. As William's forces continued their advance without significant opposition, James found himself in a position he recognized from family history. His father had faced the same closing of options, the same narrowing of support, the same sense of an entire political order turning against its king. Charles I had stayed and fought to the end. James chose differently. 2 days before Christmas 1688, James fled England. He made his way to the coast and crossed to France, where Louis XIV, whatever his private opinion of James's management of the crisis, received him with the formal courtesy owed to a king in exile. William had been aware of James's movements and had made a deliberate decision not to intercept him. An escaped James in France was a manageable problem. A captured James in England was a constitutional crisis of unpredictable dimensions, raising the question of what exactly one did with a deposed king, who was also the father of the woman about to ascend his throne. William was too shrewd a politician to want that question answered in public. He let James go. Mary, who had remained in the Low Countries while William led the invasion, now crossed to England. She had been separated from her husband during the weeks of the campaign and had spent that time in the Dutch Republic, managing the anxious waiting that was the only role available to her while the armies moved. When William secured London and sent word that she should come, she made the crossing and entered the capital in a carefully managed public event designed to present the new order to the people of England with maximum ceremonial confidence. The staging was deliberate. The message was clear. The old reign was over. The new one had begun. What remained to be settled was the precise constitutional form that the new reign would take. It was not a simple question. The legitimacy of everything that had just happened depended on the argument that Mary, as James's eldest daughter and the rightful Protestant heir, was not a usurper but a restorer, the true queen recovering her throne from a father whose conduct had forfeited his right to it. That argument required Mary to be queen regnant, exercising actual royal authority in her own right. But Mary had spent her adult life in a world that assumed a wife's proper place was beneath her husband's authority, and she had internalized that assumption deeply enough that she was genuinely unwilling to place William in the position of a mere consort, a king in name only, exercising no real power, dependent entirely on his wife's survival for whatever status he held. The solution that was arrived at was unprecedented in English history and has remained so ever since. Mary and William would rule as joint monarchs, sharing the title of king and queen regnant simultaneously. Mary's position as queen gave the arrangement its constitutional legitimacy. William's position as king gave him the real executive authority that he required, and that Mary was willing to cede. There was a historical precedent of a kind in the brief joint reign of Mary Tudor and Philip of Spain in the 1550s, but that arrangement had ended with Philip being removed from the throne when Mary Tudor died. The new arrangement went further. It was agreed that even if William outlived Mary, he would continue to rule in his own right rather than being displaced in favor of the next Protestant heir. It was, in practical terms, primarily William's reign conducted with Mary's constitutional cover. Both of them understood this, and both of them accepted it, though for rather different reasons. Parliament moved quickly to formalize the arrangements around the new reign. Before Mary and William were formally offered the throne, Parliament presented them with a declaration of right that set out with unusual explicitness the conditions under which they were receiving it. The declaration stated that it was illegal for the Crown to impose taxes without parliamentary consent. It stated that the Crown could not maintain a standing army in peacetime without parliamentary approval. It affirmed the rights of subjects to petition the Crown, to bear arms for their defense, and to be free from excessive bail and cruel punishment. It was not a revolutionary document in the sense of creating entirely new rights. Most of what it contained had been asserted in various forms by English parliaments for centuries. But it gathered those assertions into a single statement and attached them formally to the act of accepting the new monarchs. William and Mary accepted the throne on those terms, and later in 1689 the Declaration of Right was given statutory force through the passage of the Bill of Rights, one of the foundational documents of the British constitutional tradition. The coronation was organized with unusual speed. Parliament and the new monarchs were eager to stage the event as quickly as possible, partly to demonstrate the legitimacy of the new order and partly to present William and Mary formally to a public that had witnessed the extraordinary events of the previous months and needed the reassurance of ceremony. It took place on the 11th of April 1689, just weeks after the constitutional arrangements had been settled. The ceremony was unique in English history. Not a king regnant being crowned alongside a queen consort, nor a queen regnant with a king consort, but two regnant monarchs being crowned together on the same day in the same ceremony. It had never happened before and has never happened since. The practical arrangements reflected the uniqueness of the occasion. William used the traditional coronation chair that had seated English monarchs for centuries. For Mary, a second coronation chair was specially constructed, designed to resemble the original as closely as possible while being distinct from it. It was used once, on that spring morning in 1689, and it remains in Westminster Abbey today. A separate coronation orb was made for Mary by the goldsmith Robert Viner. Her coronation crown was fashioned from the crown that her stepmother Mary of Modena had worn at James II coronation 4 years earlier, a detail that carried its own quiet irony. The Archbishop of Canterbury, William Sancroft, refused to participate. He would not recognize the legitimacy of what had happened, would not crown monarchs whose accession he regarded as constitutionally improper, and absented himself from the ceremony entirely. The role fell instead to Henry Compton, the Bishop of London, who had already played his part in bringing this moment about. He had married William and Mary in 1677. He had signed the letter that invited William to invade in 1688. Now he placed the crowns on their heads and anointed them as King and Queen of England, Scotland, and Ireland. The revolution had been, in England at least, remarkably free of bloodshed. The army had not fought. The navy had not engaged. James had fled rather than contested his removal by force. The political transition from one monarchy to another had been accomplished with a speed and a relative absence of violence that later commentators would describe as glorious. Hence the name that history attached to it, the Glorious Revolution. But the absence of blood in England did not mean the absence of blood altogether. The new monarchs had opponents, and those opponents were prepared to fight. In Scotland, the Glorious Revolution was received with considerably more ambivalence than it had been in England. Many Scottish lords were deeply uncomfortable with the idea of deposing a legitimate Stuart king, whatever his faults, in favor of a Dutch prince. Scotland had its own constitutional tradition, its own relationship with the House of Stuart, and its own reasons for approaching the transition with suspicion. Negotiations between the new monarchs and the Scottish political establishment were required, and a separate settlement was eventually reached, but the process was neither swift nor smooth. Ireland presented a far more serious challenge. The majority of the Catholic lords and landowners of Ireland had found in James's brief reign the first genuine relief they had experienced in generations. The Protestant ascendancy that had dominated Ireland since the Reformation had been built on land confiscated from Catholic families, on laws that excluded Catholics from political life, and on a systematic effort to make the Catholic majority of the island subordinate to a Protestant minority. James had reversed those arrangements with a speed and decisiveness that had given the Catholic community of Ireland real reason to support him. When the Glorious Revolution removed him from the English throne, they signaled immediately that they would not accept the outcome without a fight. After fleeing England, James found in Louis XIV of France both a willing host and a militarily useful patron. France had been at war with the Dutch Republic throughout much of William's political career, and Louis had no desire to see a strong Protestant alliance between England and the Dutch Republic consolidated under William's leadership. Supporting James's effort to reclaim his thrones was, from Louis's perspective, both a matter of principle and of strategy. With French money, French soldiers, and French ships, James headed to Ireland in 1689 and quickly rallied the Catholic lords and the Jacobite forces, those who supported his claim, behind him. By the summer of 1689, he controlled most of the country. The significant exception was the Protestant north, where the walled city of Derry withstood a prolonged Jacobite siege that became one of the defining episodes of Irish Protestant historical memory. The broader context of the Irish conflict was the 9 Years' War, which had broken out in 1688 between France on one side and England, the Dutch Republic, and the Austrian Habsburgs on the other. James's campaign to reclaim his throne was one front in a much wider European conflict, and the resources and attention it required competed with the demands of that larger war. William, who had always been the primary organizer of European resistance to French expansion, now found himself fighting on multiple fronts simultaneously. In the spring of 1690, leaving Mary to manage affairs in England, William led an army to Ireland. He landed in the northeast of the island and marched south toward Dublin. James's forces and William's forces met on the 1st of July 1690 at the River Boyne, in what is now County Meath. The Battle of the Boyne was not in strictly military terms a decisive engagement. The casualties on both sides were relatively limited, and James's army was not destroyed. But the outcome was perceived as a Williamite victory, and its psychological and political consequences were immediate. James, who had been present on the field, lost his nerve and retreated. Within days he was back in France, abandoning the Irish campaign and the cause that depended on it. His departure was decisive in a way that the battle itself had not quite been. An Irish Jacobite cause without James was a cause without its central justification. The war in Ireland continued for over another year. The decisive military engagement came at the Battle of Aughrim in July 1691, where the Williamite forces crushed the remaining Jacobite army in the largest and bloodiest battle ever fought on Irish soil. The Williamite War was over. James spent the remainder of his life in France, at the court of Louis XIV, where he was treated with formal respect and provided with the establishment appropriate to an exiled monarch, but where he posed no further serious threat to William and Mary's position. He would live until 1701, never reclaiming the throne he had lost. The wider 9 Years' War between France and the Protestant alliance dragged on until the Treaty of Ryswick in 1697 brought it to a close. What had begun as the invitation of 7 English gentlemen to a Dutch prince had drawn half of Europe into a conflict that lasted nearly a decade. Mary had watched all of this from England, where she was, for much of the early 1690s, the effective ruler of the country in William's absence. The next part of her story belongs to what she did with that role, and to the brief, full, and quietly remarkable life she built in the years that remained to her. Governing a kingdom was not something Mary had been prepared for in any direct or practical sense. She had been raised as a princess, educated in the classics, trained in the accomplishments expected of a royal woman, and then dispatched to the Dutch Republic at 15 to be the wife of its most powerful political figure. Nobody had sat her down and explained the mechanics of English government, the management of parliamentary relations, the handling of court factions, or the daily administration of a state at war. Yet from the moment William left England to campaign in Ireland and other theaters of the 9 Years' War, which happened within months of their coronation in 1689, that is precisely what she was required to do. She did it without complaint and, by most accounts, with considerably more competence than those who had underestimated her expected. Her method was practical rather than assertive. She did not attempt to micromanage the apparatus of government or to position herself as the dominant political personality of the age. She worked through the Privy Council, the early modern equivalent of a cabinet, delegating the daily management of administrative affairs to senior political figures while maintaining a clear sense of where her own authority began and where it required her personal engagement. Several of the men she relied on most heavily were among the Immortal Seven who had signed the invitation to William in 1688, men who had already demonstrated both their political judgment and their commitment to the new order. The arrangement functioned well enough that William, when he returned from his campaigns, found domestic affairs in reasonable order. What Mary understood clearly was that her role was not purely administrative. She was the public face of a regime whose legitimacy was still contested by a significant number of people across the three kingdoms, and the manner in which she presented herself, as queen, as Protestant, as the rightful heir rather than a usurper, mattered as much as any policy she enacted. She attended to the ceremonial and visible dimensions of monarchy with care, understanding that the performance of royal authority was inseparable from its exercise. She was seen. She was present. She managed the perception of the new regime as consciously as she managed its business. The personal dynamics of the court were not always easy to navigate. The most persistent tension involved her own sister Anne, who had developed a deep and settled dislike of William that expressed itself in private correspondence and in the social choices she made around him, and had fallen under the considerable influence of Sarah Churchill, the wife of John Churchill, the Earl of Marlborough, who was one of the most capable military commanders in England and also a man whose loyalty to the new regime was, as events demonstrated, conditional. Sarah Churchill was intelligent, forthright, and entirely committed to advancing her own family's interests, and her influence over and had the practical effect of making Anne's household a center of opposition, however discreet, to William's management of affairs. Mary found herself obliged to act as peacemaker between her husband and her sister on multiple occasions, occupying the uncomfortable position of a woman who loved both parties and was trusted by neither as fully as she might have wished. She handled it with patience, but she was also capable of firmness when the situation required it. When evidence emerged that Marlborough was in contact with Jacobite agents on the continent, communicating with supporters of her exiled father in a way that suggested his commitment to the Williamite regime was not absolute, Mary acted decisively. She ordered Anne to dismiss Sarah Churchill from her household, and refused. The relationship between the two sisters, already strained by Anne's antipathy toward William, deteriorated sharply and never fully recovered during Mary's lifetime. Marlborough was committed to the Tower of London for several weeks before being released, and his political rehabilitation would not begin until after Mary's death. The episode illustrated something important about the kind of queen Mary was. She was not primarily a political operator in the way William was, and she did not govern through the accumulation of factional power in the manner of the great political managers of her era. But she had a clear sense of what her duty required, and when that clarity demanded a difficult personal decision, she made it. The arrest of her uncle, Henry Hyde, the second Earl of Clarendon, the brother of her own deceased mother, when he was found to be communicating with Jacobite agents, was another expression of the same quality. She was not willing to allow personal loyalty to override the obligations of her position. Her interventions in domestic policy focused particularly on the management of state finances during the enormously expensive 9 Years' War. The conflict with France placed continuous pressure on the treasury, and the challenge of funding military operations without imposing a tax burden that would alienate the parliamentary support on which the new regime depended required careful and sustained attention. Mary involved herself in the details of customs reform and revenue management with more engagement than her public image as a woman primarily interested in gardens and pugs might suggest. She was not an economist, but she understood the political consequences of getting the finances wrong, and she worked to ensure that the people around her were managing them responsibly. The religious dimension of the new reign was an area where Mary's own convictions shaped policy in direct and lasting ways. She and William were committed Protestants, and their accession was always understood as a Protestant restoration, the reassertion of a Protestant constitutional order against the Catholic monarchy that James had been building. The Act of Toleration, passed in May 1689, was one of the early legislative expressions of this commitment, and it had consequences that extended far beyond the political moment that produced it. The act granted full religious toleration to a wide range of Protestant nonconformist groups, Baptists, Puritans, Quakers, Congregationalists, who had been subject to legal disabilities and penalties under the older religious settlement. It was a significant moment in the development of religious liberty in England, one whose effects on the character of English religious life extended well into the 19th century and beyond. Mary appointed Henry Compton to lead a commission charged with reforming the liturgy of the Church of England, moving it toward a more firmly Protestant character that reflected the convictions of the new monarchs. She patronized the Society for the Reformation of Manners, founded in 1691, which concerned itself with combating prostitution, excessive drinking, profanity, and what it regarded as the corrupting influence of immoral content on the London stage. She issued formal proclamations against various social vices in the early years of her reign and supported the publication of religious sermons delivered at court that were intended to promote a sober and godly standard of public life. The contrast with the Restoration court of her uncle Charles, the theater-going, the mistresses, the cheerful disregard for conventional morality, could not have been more complete. Her patronage of the arts reflected the same Protestant cultural orientation. Henry Purcell, whom she supported throughout her reign, was a composer whose work was grounded in a distinctly English musical tradition that stood apart from the Italian, French, and Austrian Baroque styles associated with the Catholic courts of Europe. Purcell is regarded today as one of the greatest English composers of any era, a figure who developed an operatic and choral language that was genuinely original in its combination of English speech rhythms with continental musical sophistication. Mary's patronage gave him the institutional support he needed, and it was Purcell who would compose the music for her funeral, one of the most moving pieces of English Baroque music ever written, produced as a direct response to the death of the woman who had been his patron. The most enduring physical legacy of Mary's reign in England was the development of Kensington Palace. The building that became one of the defining royal residences of subsequent centuries began as a modest two-story Jacobean house in the village of Kensington, then on the western edge of London, that had been built in the reign of James I and by the late 1680s was known as Nottingham House, belonging to Daniel Finch, the second Earl of Nottingham, who served as Secretary of State. Mary and William purchased it in 1689 for reasons that were largely medical. William's asthma was aggravated by the damp air that rose off the Thames and by the coal smoke that hung over central London, and Kensington, positioned on higher and drier ground, offered a healthier environment. Mary then engaged Sir Christopher Wren, the greatest architect of the age who had already rebuilt much of London following the Great Fire of 1666, to transform the modest house into something worthy of monarchy. Wren's expansion added three-story pavilions at each end of the original building, with separate apartments for Mary and William on either side and servants' quarters fitted throughout. Extensive gardens were laid out around the grounds, drawing on the Baroque formal tradition that Mary had absorbed during her years at Het-Loo and through her familiarity with the Versailles model. The royal household moved into Kensington late in 1689, and Mary immediately began extending and improving the building further, commissioning the construction of what became known as the Queen's Gallery. A fire in 1691 that gutted portions of the older Jacobean structure was turned, characteristically, into an opportunity. The damaged sections were rebuilt with marble staircases, new galleries, and chambers of a quality that the original house had never possessed. Nicholas Hawksmoor, who was early in a career that would later include significant work on Blenheim Palace, contributed to the construction of the King's Gallery at Kensington in the early 1690s. Much of what visitors see at Kensington Palace today was added by subsequent monarchs, but the initial conception and the impetus for its development as a royal residence came directly from Mary. The redevelopment of Hampton Court Palace, the great Tudor royal estate on the Thames to the southwest of London, was another major architectural project of the reign. Mary worked again with Wren on a redesign that drew heavily on the Baroque splendor of Versailles, incorporating the formal geometric principles and the sense of grand axial arrangement that had made the French royal palace the most admired building project in Europe. The Hampton Court that emerged from this period was a significant departure from its Tudor origins, a building that reflected the European aesthetic sensibilities that Mary had developed during her years in the Low Countries. Her personal life alongside these public responsibilities was characterized by the pursuits that had given her genuine pleasure since childhood. Gardening remained a central passion, and the gardens she developed at Kensington and Hampton Court reflected a real knowledge and engagement with landscape design rather than a merely nominal royal interest. She kept pug dogs throughout her reign, maintaining in the royal palaces the tradition of canine companionship that had been established by her Stuart predecessors, and her love of animals extended to ponds of tropical fish and goldfish that appeared in the grounds of the royal residences around London. Ice skating, a pastime that her father and uncle had encountered during their years of exile in the Low Countries in the 1650s and brought back to England at the Restoration, was another pleasure she pursued with enthusiasm. She was also one of the most extensively painted monarchs of her era, associated with 97 portraits despite living only to 32 years of age. The most significant of these span her life from childhood to her years as queen. Peter Lely, the Dutch painter who had flourished under the successive patronage of Charles I, Oliver Cromwell, and Charles II, painted her around 1672 in the guise of Diana, the Greek goddess of the hunt, depicting her with a bow and arrow in the mode that was fashionable for royal portraits of the period. A second Lely portrait from around 1677, produced on the occasion of her marriage, showed her in an orange dress chosen to mark her entry into the House of Orange, and became the basis for numerous subsequent copies as her profile rose. The most recognizable portrait of her was produced by the Dutch painter Jan Verkelge around 1690, created to celebrate the accession of William and Mary, depicting her seated beside a table on which her coronation crown rests. It is the image that comes closest to fixing in the historical memory the face of the woman who carried one of the most consequential reigns of the 17th century. Among the accomplishments of Mary's reign that have proved most durable is one that had nothing to do with England itself. At the time of her accession, there was only one institution of higher learning in Britain's colonies in North America, Harvard University in New England, founded in 1636. The Virginia colony, one of the oldest and most populous of the English settlements on the American eastern seaboard, had no equivalent institution, though plans for a college there had been discussed as far back as the 1610s and 1620s without ever being realized. In 1691, a Scottish-born missionary and educator named Dr. James Blair, who had been living and working in Virginia since the mid-1680s, came to England to petition the government for a royal charter to establish a college in the colony. The proposal received the backing of the bishops of London and Canterbury, and Mary gave it her personal support. On the 8th of February 1693, the royal charter for the College of William and Mary was granted, bearing the names of both monarchs. The college was funded through a government excise on tobacco produced in Virginia, the colony's primary commercial crop, and James Blair became its first president, a position he held for an extraordinary 50 years. The college was established in what grew into the town of Williamsburg, which subsequently became the colonial capital of Virginia. The College of William and Mary stands today as the second oldest university in the United States, an institution whose founding in the reign of a queen who would die the following year connects the 17th century court of St. James's Palace to the educational landscape of modern America. Mary did not live to see much of what her reign had set in motion reach its conclusion. In November 1694, at the age of 32, she contracted smallpox. The disease was the great killer of early modern Europe, claiming approximately 15% of those who contracted it regardless of their social position, their wealth, or the quality of the physicians available to them. Mary's symptoms appeared in early December, and her condition deteriorated steadily through the second half of that month. The winter of 1694 was particularly severe, one of the coldest years of the Little Ice Age, a prolonged period of unusually low temperatures that affected much of the northern hemisphere in the 17th century. The River Thames froze solid, disrupting the transport and commerce that normally flowed along it, and making movement around London more difficult than usual. Her sister Anne, who was pregnant, was not permitted to visit. The risk of smallpox to a pregnant woman with no immunity was too great, and the doctors around Mary understood this even if they could do little else to help. William, who had returned to London and was present in the city throughout the final weeks of Mary's illness, remained close. The man who had never been described as emotionally demonstrative was, by the accounts of those around him, devastated. He had worked alongside Mary for 11 years. He had relied on her. He had governed with her. Whatever the complexities of their early marriage, What they had built together was real, and he knew it. Mary died on the 28th of December 1694 at Kensington Palace, the building she had purchased, transformed, and made into a royal residence. She was 32 years old. She had been Queen of England, Scotland, and Ireland for 5 years and 8 months. She had governed a country at war, managed a court full of competing interests, reformed the church, built palaces, founded a university, and done all of it while carrying the private knowledge that the throne she sat on had been taken from her own father. She had never had children. She had never fully resolved the grief of that. She had never, in the short span of her adult life, been free of the weight that had pressed on her from the day she was born into the House of Stuart. The frozen Thames complicated the arrangements for her funeral. Her body lay in state at the banqueting hall in Westminster for several weeks, while the practicalities of a state funeral in the depths of a hard winter were managed. The funeral finally took place on the 5th of March 1695, and it was unprecedented in one specific way that said something important about how her reign had changed the constitutional order. Both the House of Commons and the House of Lords attended in their entirety, the first time in English history that Parliament had collectively participated in a royal funeral. It was a recognition that the monarchy Mary had represented was no longer purely a personal institution, but a constitutional one, bound to Parliament by the arrangements of the Glorious Revolution in ways that the monarchy of her grandfather had never been. The cost of the funeral was £50,000, an enormous sum for the time. The music was composed by Henry Purcell. It remains among the most affecting works he ever produced, spare, dignified, and shaped by the reality of grief rather than the conventions of ceremonial occasion. William, though present in London, was too undone by his loss to attend. He watched the reign he had shared with Mary end without him in the room. She was buried in Westminster Abbey, in the south aisle of the chapel of King Henry VII. A large monument was planned, but never completed, partly for lack of suitable space in the chapel. A small stone marks the spot today. In 1725, life-size wax effigies of both Mary and William were placed in Westminster Abbey, the closest thing to a permanent memorial that the building eventually accommodated. William was later interred alongside her, the Dutch king who had needed her claim to the English throne and who, in the end, had needed her more than he perhaps knew. The girl who had cried at her own wedding grew into a woman who governed an empire largely alone while her husband fought its wars. She died before she could see the Bill of Rights she had accepted take its full place in English constitutional life. She died before the Act of Settlement of 1701 secured the Protestant succession she had sacrificed her relationship with her father to protect. She died before the Act of Union of 1707 joined England and Scotland into the single kingdom of Great Britain. She did not live to see any of it. But without the decision she made when that letter arrived at The Hague on the 30th of June 1688, none of it would have unfolded as it did. She stood at the hinge of English history, and she turned it.